There have been lots of different ways to find romance in games over the decades. There's the Mario model, of course. Save the day, rescue the damsel, get the kiss. There's also marriages in the vein of Phantasy Star 3 or locked-in romantic arcs like that of Tidus and Yuna in Final Fantasy X. But perhaps no gaming romance inspires more fan fervor than that of the romanceable companion. Morrigan in Dragon Age Origins, Judy in Cyberpunk 2077, Halsin, yes, the bear, in Baldur's Gate 3, and so many more of these characters have left lasting impressions on those who have chosen to romance them.
We shall leave together, go where we please, do whatever strikes our fancy.
What is it about romanceable companions that keep people coming back for more? And vitally, how have these RPG romances evolved from simplified gift-giving to the fully realized stories we know today? To dive into this phenomenon, we sat down with two video game romance experts.
My name is Sarah Bayless, and I'm a principal writer at Larian Studios.
My name is David Gator, and I am currently the creative director at Summerfall Studios.
Bayless wrote on Baldur's Gate 3, while Gator helped define the Bioware model of romance during his tenure there, which is why these two are the perfect people to help us examine the psychological effect romance has on gamers.
I need to feel your skin against mine, to share myself with you before we fly off into the final battle. I'll find a way.
The thing is, romance has been around for as long as we've been telling stories. Humans love love. We love watching people fall in love, especially when they're in peril.
Human stories and human connections are really important to us as people and really compelling in the kind of like media that we engage with. And romance and love and friendship and sexuality and all these things are just in us, you know, and there's this desire to explore that and explore relationships. It makes sense to me that if you're in the story, that's this huge adventure. You're facing gods and demons and your own mortality, and you're bargaining with people and you're getting cheated and you're fighting back and you're finding your values. Like, that's all really human stuff, and it makes sense to me that relationships would be part of that too. If you're playing a game that's kind of covering so much territory, it would be strange if love wasn't part of it.
That said, in RPGs, romanceable companions are relatively rare. While there are games like Fire Emblem Awakening, where the characters you pair together have gameplay consequences, or games like the previously mentioned Final Fantasy X, where a romantic arc is already part of the plot, we're looking at romances that exist as an optional narrative mechanic. The ones where the player chooses who they romance, or whether they want to pursue a romantic relationship at all. Basically, the sort of romances that serve to elevate the individual role-playing experience rather than act as utilitarian devices.
I could sit here with you all night.
It's through this model that Bioware became a titan of sorts in the kissable companion game, starting with Baldur's Gate 2 in 1999, through to Mass Effect Andromeda in 2017, and likely to continue into Dragon Age Dreadwolf. Romance has become a specialty of the studio, helping to set the standard for what a successful RPG romance driven by player choice could look like.
I care about you, Miranda, and I think you care about me.
Gator, who has just released a new musical RPG, Stray Gods, has been around since the beginning and has directly influenced the very evolution of these sorts of romances.
When we first did romances at BioWare, that was on my first game, Baldur's Gate 2, and that was just sort of as why not? And then it kind of evolved over titles and became much more of a deliberate process of, as we made a lot of mistakes, it's like, maybe we shouldn't do that. So we had to sort of start with the romances sometimes. If a character was going to be a romance, you kind of had to start with, all right, do they have a romantic archetype that they're dealing with? Do they have a sexuality, like a certain type of player that they're aimed at? Can they break up? Can they be romanced at the same time as other people are romanced? How does the romance play into the regular story? Like, if this is a side feature, and that was always the case by where they romance characters, no matter how important they were to some of the fans, they're always tertiary to the main game. So how do they interact with that main content? If you get to like the end game, is there that final, I love you, I know, kind of, that moment?
I love you.
I know.
Unlike Star Wars, though, video games have to work harder to keep players engaged for hours and hours at a time.
From a narrative perspective, you can't make a player care about the plot. The narrative design process is a series of throwing out like possible hooks. Do you care about this? Do you care about this? Do you care about this? And seeing which the player reacts to, then doubling down on that, right? So romances are just a way, really, of a hook that we throw out, and it's like that. Not only do we get the player to care about it, they care about that hook a lot.
The romance hook has become so strong that game developers use it in early marketing and even expand upon it through patches or DLC. Cyberpunk 2077, for instance, introduced at-home dates in its major 2.0 update, moments in which V gets a chance to relax with their romantic partner while they aren't off getting shot at. And let's not forget Baldur's Gate 3. The game's romances have become near synonymous with its success as they offer breadth and variety and, yes, the all-important ability to have two boyfriends at once. Larian even released a patch on Valentine's Day just to add new kiss animations and improve the current ones.
The wolf mates for life, but the bear roams free and partners as its instinct dictates. I need to stay true to my nature, and you to yours.
Deeply intertwined with romance are approval systems, the measure of how much or little a character likes you based on the actions your character takes in the game. Approval serves as both a signifier to you, the player, but also as a back-end trigger to certain events or interactions in a game. Early RPGs tended to opt for a numerical approach, displaying the threshold of approval points while assigning certain acts a numerical value. This lent itself to more transactional methods of raising approval. In Harvest Moon 64, if you wanted to reach the coveted matrimonial pink heart status with an available suitor, successfully courting them relied primarily on gaining points by bestowing upon them their preferred items. 2009's Dragon Age Origins features gift-giving like Harvest Moon, but is obviously much more complex and extensive. While Origins allows players to raise approval through gifts, diminishing returns were implemented to ensure the system couldn't be taken advantage of. Characters react to your choices in-game, as you're notified via a plus or minus until you reach whatever value is necessary to progress to a new romantic scene.
Come, my love. Put the thoughts of the ritual aside and let us make this last night together one to remember.
Lately, RPGs have moved away from a visibly quantitative approach. Instead, devs have opted for more vague indications of approval. Behind the scenes, the tracking methods remain similar, but now exact numbers are rarely displayed.
Telltale games did the so-and-so will remember that. Would they actually remember it? You had no idea. If there was actually any reactivity, you were just being told, oh, that character has noticed what you did, and you'd be like, oh, do I like that? Do I like that idea? And you're left to wonder, like, do they disapprove a lot? Do they disapprove only a little? Is that a major thing, a minor thing? You have no idea. The one thing that I'm like, one day we'll get around this is the idea that you can sort of reverse engineer your approach on a per character basis, and that hasn't changed at all. You know what this character likes. So whenever you're in conversation with them, you take the options that you think they're going to like. And that even if they're completely incongruent to how the way you talk to other characters or how you act in the game.
What Gator is getting at is the pursuit of more authentic relationships as a means of making these characters feel as real as possible. Am I a little meaner than I'd normally be whenever Astarion is in my party, for instance? Definitely. Would it be completely mortifying and hilarious if my other companions pointed that out? Of course.
You were talking to the character and taking those options just because you know they like them, and they're like, and they recognize them, they're like, but that's not the way you play the game. What are you talking about? And you're like, oh, I've been caught out. But it hasn't been done yet. That's what I like to see, though.
So maybe we've not quite gotten there yet, but we certainly can't discount the possibility as technology only continues improving. Changes have clearly been going on behind the scenes, but perhaps the most obvious denotation of how romances have evolved over the decades is quite literally what we see. If advancing technology has affected one thing for certain, it's this. Characters are way hotter now.
Sparks.
In all seriousness, it's truly a wonder to behold. We moved from text-based games like Zork in 1980 to blocky 3D renderings like Final Fantasy VII in 1997. Now, games like Baldur's Gate 3 used fully realized 3D models complete with incredibly subtle facial expressions.
Narrative design and writing and art and animation and scripting and cinematics, performance, voice and mocap. All of these people are trying to make something that is very sincere, that feels like this is what I think the character would do. And then when it comes to kind of realization, like the cinematics and the art and how the characters look and all of that being elevated to such a level, that's so special. I'm thinking of Lae'zel when she looks at you with certain eyes and you see her emotions in her face, the kind of like beauty of that can be achieved with the technology that's available now, I think really makes those moments feel really tender, and you can kind of look at her and like you would at a person and feel what she's feeling.
The motion capture for Baldur's Gate 3 was so sensitive, it was able to detect even the slightest of changes, which allowed the devs to map the performers' nuanced expressions and micro-movements to their characters, which makes romancing characters like Lae'zel even more compelling.
Together, we might survive.
It's crazy to think that the road to romancing characters like our fiery friend Karlach started over 30 years ago with games like Mortal Kombat. The OG gory fighter is credited as one of the first games to map actor movement onto a collection of characters. They used cameras to capture the actors performing their moves, which ultimately became the models for the game. The evolution of gaming engines has been a vital part of creating that realism. Enhanced 3D graphics, vocal performance, motion capture, and more combine to create life from characters that are ostensibly a collection of polygons and pixels. More and more, characters in gaming feel real. They have pores even. And what's more human than that?
You're gonna walk out of this on a red carpet.
Yeah, sure.
Hey, you deserve it. I wouldn't be alive if it wasn't for you.
Performance capture wasn't the only gaming technology to make huge leaps over the decades. Voice acting has come a long way too. Disney's 1983 arcade classic, Dragon's Lair, was the first ever game to feature human voiceover, though it was performed by developers to save money.
Lead on, adventurer. Your quest awaits.
Now that the video game industry brings in more money than Hollywood, developers can afford A-list actors like Keanu Reeves or J.K. Simmons to step into the recording booth for their games. Voiceover has become such an integral part of gaming that there's a Best Performance category at the Game Awards now, something only introduced in 2014.
Some stories don't get a happy ending for the credits roll, leaving questions you're never gonna find the answers to.
What started as a collection of 2D sprites evolved into fuzzy 3D models in crudely rendered environments, which eventually evolved into the massively detailed worlds we're seeing today.
We reached a level of technology where these characters are very realistic. You feel like you're interacting with an actual person, right? The way some players talk about these characters is that it's almost like the player are in love with the character. Like actually in love, and what happens to the character they feel so keenly, and long after the game is done, it's like I still have big feelings for these characters. I'm going to go write fan fiction or draw fan art, or maybe just carry a torch for the rest of my life and measure all my real world relationships in comparison. Very unfair, by the way.
Don't be naive. There's something between us, even though I know I shouldn't act on it.
New technology has made these worlds even more immersive, and therefore, the relationships you choose to cultivate even more meaningful. Where gaming excels is in its interactivity. No other medium allows for a two-way conversation between a game and its player.
As long as I have you, I feel like I can handle anything.
Like Gator said earlier, romantic relationships are just one more way to draw players even further into a story. But like all elements of a game, what's absolutely essential is leaving room for the player to experience the romance rather than passively receive it.
The interactivity gives you the opportunity to create the story in the way that feels the most authentic to you. And in that way, you can be witnessed as the person that you are. I think probably players will hopefully feel that. They'll hopefully feel that conversationality and the fact that you're trying to offer different ways of of interacting and kind of customize it in your own way. And I think when you click on an option, you might be even saying it in your own way. You know, like sometimes when people are streaming, they'll read the response that they're choosing and they'll put their own little spin on it.
Branching dialogue comes with the territory in choice-heavy games as player actions affect how the world and its characters react around them. We've seen robust advancements in the physicality of a game, of course, but what players don't see are the overhauled systems behind the scenes as well. Console storage itself is a clear indication of RPG's increasing complexity. The PS2 didn't even have internal storage. Instead, it saved your game on memory cards that were often a whopping 8 megabytes. Now though, the Xbox Series and PS5 boast storage capacity up to 1 terabyte, though with the size of games today, even that fills fast. Console RAM is the same. The benefit of increased capacity allows for systems to keep track of more and more player input, therefore leading to increased complexity in games. The original Xbox only has 64 megabytes of RAM. Compare that to the Xbox Series X, which has 16 gigabytes.
We're all here because we're committed to exploring space.
Baldur's Gate 3 is massive at over 100 gigabytes of data. A game like Oblivion, in comparison, required only 4.6 gigabytes. Yes, a lot of that space is dedicated to textures and models that make these games more visually impressive, but the scope of them has grown bigger as well. If we look at the Harvest Moon Back to Nature guide for wooing your partner, the walkthrough for each potential wife can fit within a few pages of a Prima guide. Remember those? Now we're seeing lengthy guides that give players direction on romancing a single character. Take this fan-made Astarion romance guide, which clocks in at 24 pages, and our very own Panam romance walkthrough is over 2 hours long.
Ugh, I'm starting to feel that stress go away.
Devs are able to expand these interactions for players because they have new tools at their disposal that provide more flexibility in developing characters. This allows experimentation in both platonic and romantic interactions. Bayliss herself describes how improved game engines gave writers room to extract, add, and edit with more ease.
When I think back to the engine that we used for Original Sin 1, which is the first game I worked on, writing dialogues was more difficult. You would write something, and I think our approach, or my approach to it, was more preservationist because it was quite hard to make changes once we had already done something. And then when we went to Original Sin 2, we changed the technology and it became a lot easier to iterate and a lot easier to cut and paste and delete and move things around.
She uses Karlach as an example, explaining how tackling her romance actually helped in sculpting the entire character.
The first romance scene I wrote for Karlach, like we knew there was going to be this kind of moment where you could pursue someone romantically after spoiler alert, like dealing with the Druid's Grove. And there's this big party and you can choose someone that you're going to talk to. And I was writing that romance for Karlach, and I had kind of written a lot of stuff for Act 1 with her. And I did the scene and I played it back and I thought, this is kind of like stepping on Lae'zel's toes a little bit, like the tone felt a little bit too similar. And it made me think, has this whole approach so far been too much like Lae'zel? Is there enough differentiation here that's going to set her apart? And after writing that scene, I kind of was like, let me rethink this and change tacks quite severely. So she got a lot more of her kind of dorkiness and her zhuzh, her Karlachness.
Accounting for variety and player choice is a massive part of what makes this flexibility so important. Writing for games like Baldur's Gate 3 or Dragon Age is complicated because it requires reactivity, the ability to tell multiple stories quite literally at once. Not only does the game have to give the player multiple dialogue options, it then has to track how each of those options affect relationships or events in the game, while also ensuring that every dialogue tree doesn't leave out any necessary context.
When you're writing a game, it's the player is this nebulous concept. You don't control the pacing. You don't know their motivation. So you are sort of, like I said, throwing out those hooks, the breadcrumbs, trying to lead them through the maze of your story by making them care enough to keep moving forward. So I've always found that people who spent a lot of time DMing often would come in if they were becoming a game writer, and they'd be the ones who would click with that, that idea I'm not the one who's controlling the story per se, I'm just leading them through its story. Yeah, that makes sense to me.
If relationships play a huge factor in driving the stakes of a game, it makes sense that nuanced characters only elevate a story. Whether we're accepted or rejected by a character, we get the chance to choose how we behave. But the best games remind us that we're not running rampant through a stale dollhouse. We're experiencing and enacting consequences that affect the very world that we've been dropped into.
Jacques Farnash do, source of my bruises.
Technology isn't the only thing that's been pushing game design into new creative territory. Social progress has done its fair share too. In the early days of RPGs, romance was confined to the opposite sex. In some cases, even today, queer romances may represent a single option among many. In Fire Emblem Fates, for instance, a player is only permitted to romance 2 characters if you're of the same sex, Niles and Rajat. Gator himself tells us that Dragon Age Origins was his first opportunity to write a queer romance into a game. At first, those romances received positive reactions from the public, though oddly, some vocal players have seemingly become more hostile, not less.
And then all of a sudden, the temperature on the internet suddenly changed when you suddenly had these very loud, albeit small number of voices that just were constantly griping about anything that wasn't aimed at them. And from a creator standpoint, it honestly is it's more stories I can tell in my toolbox. It's like, I don't want to tell the same old story every single time about the same dude hero who's white with the very short brown hair, because that was every single protagonist. And, you can only tell so many stories with that.
It's fascinating to watch the expansion of queer representation even as a franchise progresses. Take Kaiden Alenko in the Mass Effect series. In 2007's first installment of Mass Effect, he's only available as a romanceable companion for a female Shepard. However, 5 years later, Mass Effect 3 unlocked him as an option for male Shepard as well.
The Reapers better watch themselves.
Jaal of Mass Effect Andromeda is a similarly interesting case. After drawing criticism for the lack of romance options available to a queer Scot writer, Bioware patched the game in order to make Jaal bisexual. A popular refrain against these choices basically shrieks at the idea of queer inclusivity as a means of appeasing fans. Though, honestly, there's an argument to be made that inclusivity for inclusivity's sake is almost always worth it. However, this extended beyond that. Players noticed the world introduced by Mass Effect Andromeda and subsequently questioned its oversight in following its own rules. Jaal is an Angara, a race of aliens who embrace gender fluidity, so it ultimately proved strange that he was heterosexual by in-game human standards.
You make my heart sing.
There are 2 primary approaches to queer romance in gaming. First, what we've seen in Baldur's Gate 3 or Stardew Valley, wherein every romanceable option is open to a player regardless of gender. The strength here is that more content is made available to the largest possible audience. The second approach is more visible in games like Cyberpunk 2077 or Dragon Age Inquisition. Here, romanceable characters have set sexualities, defining just who can romance them. Judy Alvarez, for instance, is a lesbian character available only to a female V. Iron Bull very clearly acknowledges himself as pansexual. This may seem to limit options, but what it provides is more visible representation of queer identities within gaming itself.
When I started, it would only existed in the romance. So if a player didn't opt into any of the romances, they literally would not see it. And that was because everybody at the studio was very like, can we do this? Can we do this? Is there going to be like a lot of blowback? What I like, and it's seen more and more of, is not only are we seeing the queerness in the romance stories, which the player has to opt into, but we're seeing more and more characters just out in the world, like that you just come across and they exist and there's no need for anybody to justify their existence.
And he's right. Characters like Krem, a trans man in Dragon Age Inquisition, or Lovebirds Dame Ayland and Isabel in Baldur's Gate 3 expand these worlds into further realism.
Begone! I must admire Isabel's fulsome beauty away from prying eyes.
Sorry.
queer people exist, so it makes sense their love stories would appear in gaming as well. Gender fluidity has increasingly become more common too. Some character creators are treating the body as another element of customization, as opposed to a marker of gender. Baldur's Gate 3, for instance, allows the player character to identify as non-binary, while Cyberpunk 2077 lets you choose either a femme or masc voice regardless of the base body type selected.
Let's talk a little while longer, before I have to delta somewhere.
These additions, however small, are an exciting forecast for the future of queer representation in video game romance. One can only hope we continue to see even more variety in both gender and sexuality in the characters that occupy these worlds we explore. Whether you woo your favorite companions or not, romance has become a massive part in what draws players to new games. I know I'm certainly waiting in anticipation for Dragon Age Dreadwolf just to squeal over the romance options. So maybe take a few extra minutes to go on a little video game date, slaying enemies with your chosen partner. And always remember, roses are red, violets are blue. Isn't it great you can kiss people in video games too?
You put the stars to shame. Let's sit here another while. I want to drink you in.